Hello, and welcome to the Harvard Law School lecture series, Democracy. This series is co-hosted by Professor Guy Uriel-Charles, Professor Lawrence Lessig, Professor Nicholas Stephanopoulos, and me, Ruth Greenwood. I am the director of the brand new election law clinic here at Harvard. The mission of the clinic is to train the next generation of election lawyers through litigation and advocacy that brings novel academic ideas to the practice of election law. We have just started our very first semester with a gaggle of excited students in person, and we are hard at work developing our strategic impact litigation. For any of the students watching along today, feel free to go to our website, hlselectionlaw.org, to find out how you can apply to be a student. And for alumni, please get in touch with me if you want to help out by being a pro bono co-counsel or supporting us in any other way. We're really excited to have this as a clinic for the whole HLS community. There is so much going on in the law of democracy that we thought it was worth bringing some of the brightest minds and most ardent activists to campus via Zoom, so that as a community, HLS alumni, staff, and students can discuss the challenges we face and workshop solutions. Today's panel is the first in a 6-part series with 3 panels each semester throughout this academic year. We will cover the future of the Voting Rights Act, the role of social media in democracy, and many other topics. And you can find out more at the website hlsdemocracy.live. Before we start, I want to add a quick but profound thank you to Adam Harper and Catherine Cronin for all their help in getting this series underway. It is now my pleasure to hand over to the brilliant Professor Nicholas Stephanopoulos. Professor Stephanopoulos is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law here at Harvard and is one of the brightest minds in election law today. Nick was also the architect behind 2 partisan gerrymandering cases that went to the Supreme Court over the last 5 years. And he has written dozens of articles in top law journals, but he publishes his more eccentric ideas, like using reconciliation to offer tax credits for voting, in popular publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. Okay, over to you, Professor Stephanopoulos.
Thank you, Professor Greenwood, for that very generous introduction. And a big thank you also to our panelists today and to the many alumni and students in attendance. As Ruth noted, this is a very exciting time for the study of election law at Harvard Law School. We'll be running this democracy speaker series throughout this year. Professor Greenwood is the director of the brand new election law clinic at HLS, which will be launching novel election law lawsuits across the country. HLS now has a law and politics workshop dedicated to cutting-edge election law scholarship. Guy Uriel-Charles, one of the country's leading election law experts, just joined the HLS faculty this summer. I am also a relative newcomer to HLS, having moved here less than 2 years ago. And Ruth, Guy, and I all join Larry Lessig, Michael Klarman, Charles Freed, and several more faculty members who research and write in this area. However, while it's an exciting time for election law at HLS, it's a more fraught moment for democracy in America. Allegations of voter suppression, election subversion, gerrymandering fill the airwaves and the pages of legal briefs. Claims of widespread election fraud are also quite common, if unsupported by the evidence. There's more election litigation than ever before in American history. And Congress is currently considering 2 massive bills that, if passed, would constitute the most important federal electoral legislation in decades, maybe even ever. So the timing of this session on democracy in peril couldn't be better. Our first panelist today, Congressman John Sarbanes, has represented Maryland's 3rd congressional district since 2007. He chairs the House of Representatives Democracy Reform Task Force, which promotes accountability and transparency in government. He's also the key congressional architect of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which is the enormous bill that would dramatically reform voting, redistricting, and campaign finance, among many other areas. And Congressman Sarbanes is a graduate of this fine institution. Our second panelist, Isosa Osa, is the Research and Policy Director for Fair Fight Action. Fair Fight Action was launched by Stacey Abrams after the 2018 election to protect the right to vote, both in Georgia and nationwide. Ms. Osa leads Fair Fight Action's national and Georgia-based policy portfolio with a focus on pro-democracy reform. And she also leads the group's disinformation research, polling, messaging, and opposition research efforts. And our third panelist, Evan Osnos, is a staff writer for New Yorker and one of my personal favorite journalists at the magazine. He's the author of 3 terrific books, Age of Ambition about modern China, a biography of Joe Biden, and his most recent project, Wildland, The Making of America's Fury. It's this last book that I think might be most relevant to this panel, since it explores the anger, fear, and greed of many Americans, which of course are forces that powerfully shape contemporary politics. With that, let me quickly note that audience members can ask questions of the panelists using the Q&A feature on their screens. But before we get to the Q&A, I'm first going to turn the floor over to each of the panelists for their introductory remarks. And Congressman Sarbanes will lead us off. And so with that, I'll turn the floor over to the Congressman.
Well, thanks very much, Nick. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to join with you and with Ruth and the distinguished panel. I want to congratulate you on establishing this center of gravity around election law and focusing on all of the challenges that are coming at us in this moment. And Professor Guy, Uriel Charles, Professor Lessig are folks that I've worked with before. So this is a terrific effort. I want to salute you for it. Also delighted to be joined on the panel by Evan Osnos. I'm a great fan of his work. Looking forward to his comments and analysis of the time that we're in, the moment that we're in right now. And Isosa Osa, who I've also been working with very closely for some period of time now, who's doing terrific work at Fair Fight, particularly tracking a lot of the misinformation that's out there, making sure that we're staying on our toes in terms of responding to that. So I'll try to be relatively brief on the front end, because I think the most productive dimension of this will be answering some of your questions and the questions that are coming from the audience that's joining us today. We talk about democracy being in peril. I think that's absolutely the case right now. I think if you look at what happened last November, it was 150 million Americans fought their way to the polls, overcoming tremendous obstacles in many places in order to pull our democracy back from the brink. But we know that it is still in a fragile state. In other words, what we were able to pull back needs a lot of fortifying and strengthening if it's going to sustain what we think of as American democracy and all the best that our society can offer to the people of this country. And so this is very, very timely. My own view, and I think Evan is probably the expert on this, so I'm going to defer to his analysis ultimately, but I think that we've reached this moment because of a deep cynicism out there in the body politic. I've certainly been tracking that since my time in Congress. I'm now serving in my 8th term. And increasingly, we have seen a feeling, a sentiment among the broad public. I encounter this every day when I'm out on the hustings talking to my constituents, a feeling that insiders sort of control the agenda of public policy in Washington, that the average person has been pushed to the margins of their own democracy. And I think the public perceives rightly that things like voter suppression, election subversion, partisan gerrymandering are tools that are being used to diminish the voice of the people out in the country. And then once representatives get to Washington, it's big money and insiderism that ends up diminishing the voice of the people in the place where laws are made. You put those two things together, no wonder that you see an anger and frustration out there in the public. I think in many ways, this was perceived by Donald Trump in 2016, and the public, in a sense, used the blunt instrument of his view of how to fix things, which was to come to Washington and kind of attack corruption in the frame that he built. But that was, in my view, a kind of destructive response. The good news from my vantage point is that in 2018, we saw a class of reformers running primarily for House seats, House of Representatives races, who saw this same anger and cynicism out there in the public, but came with a different solution. They came with this proposal that instead of kind of burning the place to the ground when we get to Washington, what we'll do is try to fix it, make it work better, lift up your voice, make you central again to the way our democracy operates and the way public policy is made. And in many places where that anger was seething, they were able to meet it and channel it to a more positive place. And they came in 2018 as the vanguard of this effort to reform so many of the things that are broken in our politics and strengthen our democracy, and demanded that we lead with what became H.R. 1, the For the People Act. So by March 8th of 2019 in the 116th Congress, we had passed this landmark, overarching, comprehensive bill to address many of these ills that people perceive in our democracy. It went over to the Senate, didn't go anywhere from there because Mitch McConnell was sort of barring the door in terms of pushing that forward. We came back, and on March 3rd of this year, the House passed the bill again, making a very powerful statement that we remain absolutely committed to getting this done. And in fact, that the need for it is greater than ever, based on what we've seen over the last few months and the last couple of years, really. So we got it passed in the House. It is in the United States Senate right now. I think it does much to address this deep cynicism that I've spoken about and to strengthen our democratic institutions. We'll talk more about this, but addressing things like voter suppression, election subversion, extreme partisan gerrymandering, and the undue influence that big money has had on the way policy gets made in Washington. All of these things find a response in the For the People Act. The latest development, as many of you will know if you're participating in this discussion today, is that last Monday in the United States Senate, a new bill was introduced called the Freedom to Vote Act. This is not H.R. 1, but it contains many of the core elements that can meet the threats that are coming at us in this moment. Really, what I would argue, existential threats when it comes to the state of our democracy. So I'm very encouraged by the fact that it was introduced, and in particular that it was introduced by 8 senators, including Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who had been working over a period of time to hammer out a kind of streamlined version of democracy reform. And to have that ownership, to have Senator Manchin's ownership of the bill at this critical moment, I think is really key. There's going to be some period of time of trying to shop that to Republicans. I don't have high hopes about getting support there based on what we've seen previously. And then there will have to be a really good discussion about what to do on the rules front with respect to the filibuster if it's important to get this over the finish line, which certainly I believe it is. So you're holding this conversation, the discussion, right at an inflection point, really, in the process we've been pursuing for months now to try to get this bill over the finish line. And I think in the coming weeks, we're gonna see whether success is at hand. If so, I think we will have done something transformative that can really position the country again to embrace our democratic ideals and begin to chip away at that deep cynicism which we've seen building up over the last few years. This bill, in combination with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is the effort to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act of 1965, are two key ingredients that we need to make sure that everyday Americans feel that their voice matters and that they make a difference in their own democracy. So very excited to be here with you today. Looking forward to the discussion and the questions. And as they say on the Hill, I will yield back to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Ms. Osa, you're up next.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. I'm thrilled to be on such a wonderful panel speaking about speaking on a topic that I think is so incredibly important and salient right now, and hope to explain a bit about how this crisis that we're in is manifesting in Georgia and is manifesting on the state level, and how important to the congressman's points, the For the People Act, the Freedom to Vote Act is in remedying or mitigating so much of this that we see. Starting earlier this year, we began to see states pass voter bills at breakneck speed, these voter suppression bills. And it's important to understand what we mean by voter suppression. When we say that term, we have it's a three-pronged test, as our founder likes to say. Can a voter register to vote without undue burden? Can a voter cast a ballot without undue burden? And can a voter have that ballot counted fairly? And we saw bills, 581 total bills introduced across the country to restrict all three of those questions. We saw 52 of those restrictions enacted into law across 21 states. Georgia was one of the first, where they introduced over 50 bills in a single session just to restrict voting. 7 days after the insurrection, we had 5 House bills introduced to restrict voting. Another 9 were introduced by the end of the month. By February 3rd, we had 20. By February 10th, we were at 30, and it was a nonstop onslaught, eventually culminating in the passage of SB 202 and multiple local bills that were going to have a tremendous and profound effect on elections moving forward in Georgia. And SB 202, this larger omnibus bill, fundamentally expanded criminalization and intimidation in Georgia's election laws. It restricted access to voting, and it allowed for election subversion. And so we try to raise the alarm about this as early as possible, that on that first point, expanding criminalization, that if you're codifying mass challenges, we saw 364,000 voters in Georgia challenged during the runoff, making that process easier in Georgia, banning voters from receiving donations of food and water while in long lines. We saw 11-hour long lines in Georgia, and long lines are such a massive problem, especially in the South in this country, post-Shelby, post over 2,000 polling locations closing. We saw a bill that cut the runoff period, that made provisional ballots more difficult to count, that ended mobile voting, that restricted early vote hours, that restricted absentee application deadlines, that absolutely slashed and destroyed all type of drop box access relative to the previous year, that instituted new ID requirements, on and on and on. And that also allowed, and one of the most insidious parts, this election subversion, these takeovers to ensue with very little cause. And that's actually, again, something that Georgia may have been one of the first, but we continue to see escalate across 20 states so far that have actually passed into law bills shifting election authority from local officials, criminalizing election officials and voters, making new fines, or finding ways to increase investigations into these same folks. And so in Georgia and in particular, what we are right now, as we speak, moving through the very first takeover process with Fulton County, the largest county in Georgia with the most voters of color. It is an extremely easy process to initiate. It's extremely easy to initiate in progressive counties. And it feeds into this incredible and extraordinary amount of disinformation that we are seeing proliferate around the country, that are being buoyed by all of these laws being passed, all of these restrictions. Not only are they actually restricting and making it more difficult to vote, but they are also providing the fodder and the evidence necessary for folks to say, there is a problem. We do need these laws. There is a purpose in all of this disinformation. There are multiple levels of harm here. And when you are surrounded by disinformation, trying to help voters, trying to provide guidance, you end up in a situation where democracy is truly in peril. You end up in a situation where we have counties being taken over in Georgia where 1/3 of election workers are considering resigning across the country because of the number of threats that they are facing, just trying to do there is a really fundamental democratic job. If you've ever gone into a polling location as a poll worker or an election observer, it's a really truly beautiful thing, seeing all of these usually elderly folks. We need a lot more young people trying to count ballots, trying to move people through, seeing people come with their families, with their children to vote, and those are the same people that are being consistently threatened and pushed out of these jobs or these roles. And so the Freedom to Vote Act has really never, the For the People Act has never been more critical in terms of helping, giving us more tools to fight some of these efforts on the ground. And in Georgia in particular, this legislation will mitigate long lines, will end something called the use it or lose it policy, where inactive voters are removed from voting rolls. It'll mitigate these takeovers. It'll stop these challenges. It'll prevent the throwing out of ballots. Help mitigate this effort to restrict people from being able to get food and water in line. Undo a lot of the absentee ballot restrictions and drop box restrictions that we've seen. And if 2020 and 2021 never happened, like, we should not forget that without all of these bills being introduced across this country, our voting laws are riddled with restrictions from Jim Crow 1.0 still, that have caused untold damage, especially for Black and Brown voters. And so we should be absolutely clear about the transformative nature of what Congressman Sarbanes has been working on, that this bill will blunt these century-old Jim Crow tactics that are steeped and stained in racism to restrict Black bodies and Black movement. This bill will end these mass voter challenges that have been used for centuries against voters, end witness requirements, instill the franchise back to folks, to new citizens. So many different things that we can make better and mitigate, and have tools to use, because I said 50 bills were introduced, only one was passed, or only a few were passed. Session starts back up here quite soon. And we are ready and prepared for the rest of those to come back forward, and other states will act in a similar way, especially now that the Voting Rights Act has been even further diminished. We desperately need the Freedom to Vote Act to pass. We desperately need the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to pass. And so I'm so happy to be here today to talk more, and again, cannot say how important it is, the work that the folks on this call are doing on this effort. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Nick.
Great, thank you very much. And Mr. Osnos, you're our final presenter today.
All right, thanks, Nick. I have to say it is a real pleasure to be here, particularly to be in some conversation of sorts, as best we can do in a digital format, with Congressman Sarbanes and with Ms. Osa. I've been a consumer of your work in one form or another, and in my work at the New Yorker and in books, I sort of try to take often the role of the translator, taking things from people who are in the trenches working on legislation and trying to situate it into a broader context. And that is essentially what I will try to do just over the course of a few minutes here. I think there is a natural fit between what we've just been hearing about, which is essentially the legislative work that is being done, and what I'll try to fill in, which is a little bit of a sense of how I've approached this issue. How did we get here? Why are we even in a moment when an event as timely as this is necessary? And I think it is a measure of just how grave the situation is. I try to look at this through the lens really of small d democratic culture, in effect trying to ask, what are the constituent ingredients of our crisis of American democracy? And we didn't arrive here overnight. And to some degree, there are elements of this that go back to Jim Crow 1.0. There are elements of this that are specific to the political technology and literal technology of our moment. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But just a couple of factoids that I think are important to mention here at the outset. The reason why I came to this, why I started on this project now 6 years ago, or as we say in our house, 2 kids ago. I had no kids at the beginning of this, and now I finished this surrounded by our son and daughter. And I really do feel as if I'm sort of writing this project to try to help them understand the world that they came into. When I started on this when we moved back to the United States. My wife and I have been abroad for a decade. We come back, we land in Washington, D.C., and one particular piece of data jumped out at me, which is that if you look at Americans' trust in government, the number had collapsed over the course of a half century. In 1964, 77% of Americans said they generally trusted the government. 50 years later, 2014, that figure was down to 18%. And so in effect, even before Donald Trump came in with his particular way of capitalizing on that, and I very much agree with Congressman Sarbanes that there is a way in which he capitalized on it to his own, opportunistic benefit on something that was a reservoir of political energy. And the question is, why was it there? And it was, in a sense, it reflects 2 things. One, and I think this one is, worth describing briefly, which is that there was it was the making of cynicism to some degree. There was a political identity, a label, an industry of trying to diminish American confidence in the institutions of government, in the idea that government itself could actually be a source of good in your life. And we don't need to belabor the point. We know the literature of this that goes back 40 years or so, but that was an important piece of this. So there is some portion of Americans for whom actually losing faith in government, acquiring a certain kind of cynicism, was actually the point. And then there is another point, which I think is in some ways more interesting, more complicated, which is that also, particularly on the left, there was this fraying of confidence in the institutions of government as being reflective of the public will. Give you a data point. When I came back to Washington, Congress at that point was 50% millionaires, 82% men, and 83% white. And that didn't happen overnight. That was a confluence of all of the kinds of long-running institutional reasons that we can talk about. But fundamentally, the effect was that large portions of Americans were feeling as if the system was simply incapable of serving its most basic function, which is taking public attitudes, public will, and putting them into the work of government. As a result, we are in the situation today where you have things like 71% of Americans who want some protection of voting rights, greater protection of voting rights, and we are seeing all of the kinds of barriers that our two previous speakers have described. You also see 90% of Americans who want gun safety legislation of some real kind, and yet we see real sclerosis on that front. And but I will say there are moments of confidence that I see within that. But fundamentally, what we've heard so much of is thoughts and prayers rather than actual action on gun safety. And then, of course, also you've got 70% of Americans who want real action on climate change. So all of these ways in which people have found that the public will has been bottled up, that is at the core of creating a climate in which Americans have begun to say, it's on us to go outside of the system and on particularly to try to solve problems on our own. And that was the origins, both on the left and the right, of things like the Occupy movement, which ended up then leading back into government and having an effect on things within the formal structures of Congress. And then on the right, you saw the origins of the Tea Party movement, which was in its own way a kind of gesture of cynicism. But those were all born of that growing sense of frustration. I want to mention just a couple of items that I think are ingredients in the stew here. One is to go back to the legacy of 9/11. It's on my mind these days because obviously we just marked the occasion of 20 years. But one of the things that struck me when I came back after being away was the way in which fear had been capitalized on in politics. And there was a remarkable measure of this. Survey was done of Americans, asking them to estimate the share of the American public that is Muslim. This is 15 years after 9/11. And the average estimate people gave was 1 in 6. The real number is 1 in 100. So that kind of distortion of the sort of reality, that misunderstanding of the actual nature of the country, did not happen by immaculate conception. It was a product of, for commercial reasons, for political opportunistic reasons, you had this generation of fear, which ultimately contributes to a lot of the sense of divisiveness. The reason why I mention that divisiveness is that what I'm trying to describe is a culture of how it became possible that some leading members of a major American political party could think it was okay to try to systematically deprive Americans of the right to vote. How did that happen in 2020, 2021? And I think in order to understand that, these kinds of sort of what we might call the soft tissue of political culture become important. I'll mention two other items that I think are important. I don't want to take up too much time, but one of them is what I describe in the book as the combat mindset, which is in effect something that has been present in American life for a long time, but has been refined and refined in a malevolent way, which is that if you go to the NRA convention or you go to any of the kind of allied political events of various kinds, there is a degree to which politics has come to be described as entirely, particularly on the right, obviously, has come to be described as a matter of almost physical life and death, that it is, you are in this fight against people, usually, quote unquote, from outside. There's a sort of xenophobic through line here in which you are being told that it is a matter of literal life and death. The reason why I mention this combat mindset, a term that comes out of gun culture, is that as a reporter, I was there at the Capitol on January 6th. And when you were trying to understand essentially how did this level of political fantasy, the idea that you could overturn a settled election, how did that cross the blood-brain barrier to physical violence? you have to understand it in the context of this longer running narrative about the use of violence as a legitimate tool of politics. And we can have a longer conversation about how that reaches back 150 years, because it does. But I think one of the things we'll talk about a little later is the way in which I think the current moment has brought specific things to it. Last thing I'll mention, which I just think is important, has to do with greed. And I credit Nick for identifying that word in the introduction today, because I think it's an essential piece of understanding some of our political crisis. There is a telling moment a few years ago that I sometimes think of. In the book, I decided to go to 3 places I've lived in this country, 3 very different places, as a way of actually getting into the details of how our political culture has begun to fray, rather than deal in the abstractions. And so I go to Chicago. I worked at the Chicago Tribune for a long time, went to Clarksburg, West Virginia, where I'd been as a young journalist. And I also went to Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a place where I grew up. And I think I'll linger on Greenwich for just a second, because I think it's a telling detail, which is that Greenwich, after all, was the birthplace, literally, of the Bush family political dynasty. And the family, H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, they represented a certain mode of moderate Republican values. And whatever we say about them, they did represent certain things, like a certain belief in the idea of the legitimacy of taxation. And Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, grandfather of George W. Bush, he was somewhat at odds with other members of his party and saying, look, we have a responsibility, if we want this country to thrive, to actually be taxed. And we have to be able to spend money in order to pay for things like education, research and development, and so on. Fast forward to 2013, and there was a candidate for governor in the state of Connecticut from Greenwich, a private equity executive who had done very well. He had a collection of classic cars. He owned 2 British fighter jets. He lived in a house that was described in the local paper as resembling the Hogwarts castle. And when he revealed his tax returns to reporters, he showed that he had paid $673 in federal tax the previous year. This is 3 years before Donald Trump was elected president. And the reason I mention this is that it is very hard to have a functioning political commons when some of the people in the greatest position to pay for the institutions of governance have come to the view that they're not going to contribute in the way that they might have. And so I know that for some will be a provocative point, but I think you can't really talk about our political culture without talking about the role of money in it. I will end there and turn back over to our esteemed moderator, and thank you for bearing with us.
Terrific. Thank you very much to all of the panelists for their thoughtful remarks today. As I mentioned before, if folks in the audience have questions for the panelists, please submit them using the Q&A feature on your screens. And I'll do my best to get to as many of the questions as I can. Let me start with a question for Congressman Sarbanes. Congressman, both the For the People Act and the Freedom to Vote Act contain dozens and dozens of different provisions addressing many aspects of American elections. Which parts of the bill do you think are the most vital, the most necessary in our current political moment, and why?
Well, let me start with why there are so many provisions in there. This has to do with what the public has been telling us. So to cure that cynicism, to address the sense of frustration, anger people have, it's not enough to clear a path to the ballot box, although that's critical, because people say, well, if you get to Washington and you get captured by special interests and big money, to Evan's point, then you haven't solved our problem, which is that we feel left out and marginalized in our democracy. You're not translating our voice into public policy that matters. So one of the things we perceived is anytime proposals came forward to sort of significantly downsize the breadth of this proposal to fix our democracy, it was the public that would push back and say, wait a second, we need all these things if we're going to actually start to trust in government again and build back our faith in the institutions. Having said that, I think what you have to look at are what are the core elements that respond to the threats that are coming at us right now. So on voter suppression, absolutely, you've got to have provisions that create broad access across the country for a diverse electorate so that every 2 years, people can show up, regardless of where they're from, what their background is, what their color is, what their ethnicity is, what their socioeconomic status is. They should be able to show up and have their voice counted and their vote counted. And this responds to the basic plea on the part of the public when they say to us, why do we have to run an obstacle course every 2 years? Let's make it possible for people to register and vote in America. So we have provisions on early voting, establishing a minimum number of days of early voting, promoting and enabling voting by mail, which the public embraced in the last election, making sure that there aren't onerous and divisive and repressive voter ID laws in place across the country so that that doesn't become a way of stopping people from showing up at the ballot box. So all of these elements, which frankly were in many ways drafted by John Lewis. He spent the last 10 years of his life advocating for this broad set of democracy reforms, are absolutely critical. A second thing that's really come more into focus since the election is this idea of election subversion. The idea that you could actually reach into the mechanics of our voting infrastructure and undo the count or the tally or the basic result of an election. So one of the new pieces that's come into the mix and is part of the Freedom to Vote Act are provisions that respond to election subversion. Make sure that state officials can't reach down and meddle on what local election officials are doing. Make sure there's protection against harassment of election officials, election workers, volunteers, poll workers, and so forth. Absolutely critical. Third piece, when it comes to respect, the public wants to see this extreme partisan gerrymandering eliminated. And so we have strong provisions in there that would do that. And then the money is a huge issue. People are convinced, and they're right, that the reason you can't get progress on all these issues they care about is the undue influence of money. Wall Street is writing tax policy instead of it being done for the American people. The oil and gas and fossil fuel industry, with their lobbyists and their campaign contributions, have stopped climate change legislation. The gun lobby gets in there and inhibits our efforts to promote gun safety. Big pharma weighs in to stop us from reducing prescription drug prices. That's these sinister forces operating inside Washington behind the curtain. And so we have to have provisions in the mix, including things like the Disclose Act and other efforts to hold this dark money and big money accountable. And those are definitely part of the solution. So as long as you have those core elements, you've got something that can fix what ails us when it comes to a democracy in this moment. Those are in the Freedom to Vote Act. Now it's all about getting it over the finish line. The good news here is we were ready. When all these things were happening, oh, what are we going to do? Look at these laws across the country that they're passing. What can we do? Well, there's a bill for that. Oh, look at the new round of partisan gerrymandering coming down the pike. What's the response going to be? Well, we have a bill for that, et cetera. So we have what it takes. What we need to do is get over the finish line. Last point, none of this is controversial to the broad public. Republicans, Democrats, Independents support these changes according to every poll. The only controversy is why is it taking lawmakers so long to get to the point where we might actually get this done? We cannot miss the opportunity.
Thank you, Congressman. Ms. Osa, at the state level, voting activists like you have a variety of different tools you can use: litigation, grassroots advocacy, lobbying, advertising, direct democracy, et cetera. How do you think about the relevance and the effectiveness of those different tools as you try in your work to lower obstacles to voting?
Thank you. That's a great question, Nick. And I think we try our founder Stacey Abrams would say, to use belts, suspenders, buttons, anything in your toolkit. This is not an issue that is going to be solved via one avenue or the other. We need all of the above and more to be effective. What I do think is crucially important to all of those avenues is organizing. Organizing should be underpinning your any type of litigation strategy, any type of all advocacy strategy, all legislative strategy. Are you speaking to folks on the ground? Are you doing the real hard and true work? Are you calling your members of Congress? Are you making sure that people know how to sign up to be poll workers, how to sign up to be election officials? Are you doing the on the ground organizing work that allows all of those avenues to be successful? So I hope it's still an answer to say all of the above, but really truly looking at organizing as the core true through line of it all.
Great. Here's a question for Mr. Osnos. So anger, inequality, division, greed, which you mentioned in your remarks, these aren't forces that are unique to our current era or even to our country. And so I wonder, can we learn anything from previous periods in US history or from the experiences of other countries about overcoming these forces and doing a better job promoting the common good?
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. I think in particular, there is one period in American history that is worth looking at, which is just over a century ago. Basically, the transition at the end of the Gilded Age, you had a period in which we had also, not dissimilar to today, you had this tremendous level of inequality. You had political polarization. You had a sort of level of what we could describe as cultural narcissism, of ways in which particularly people in public life were dedicating themselves to advancing their own interests at the cost of others. And yet you also then had that give way to the progressive era. And there are ways in which we can draw some lessons from that. I think it's in the progressive era, it's worth reminding folks that really was a period of dramatic reform. And, you had the creation of public high schools, you had labor unions, federal income tax, financial regulation, and a remarkable measure of just how dramatic the change was that in 1912, all three major presidential candidates, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, adopted the progressive label. They wanted to be known as progressives. They were all supporting anti-monopoly laws and a progressive income tax. By the way, the definitive work on that transition moment comes to us from Robert Putnam and Shailin Romney Garrett, and I do recommend their book in strong terms. They wrote a book called The Upswing, which really helps us chart some of this effect over time of going from these moments of disarray to moments of political consolidation or of democratic restoration of some kind. And one of the points that comes across there is that the pendulum does not swing on its own. It's not as if we can just sort of count on the cycles of history to say, okay, this happened before, we'll be fine. In fact, it takes people to push the pendulum. And I think my co-panelists today are two of the people who are doing that, who are essentially saying we're going to pick up on what is going wrong in the small d democratic culture and figure out how to fix it. But I will also add one other thing, which I think is important to mention, because I think there is sometimes a tendency to say, well, we've been through this all before, nothing to worry about, or not quite that, I'm being glib, but to say because we've survived other democratic crises, is this any different? And the conclusion that I came to is, in fact, though, that the tools of anti-democratic activism, the tools that are designed to replace the public will with the power of money, the tools to keep people away from voting using technology, voter suppression, things that would discourage people from voting using disinformation, that those tools are, in fact, modern tools. They are new, and we have to recognize in some sense that they are different or as different from some of their predecessors as they are distinctly modern technologies, and so it's worth acknowledging that, because that means somehow that the degree of our response and the tools of our response should be different too.
Great. Let me now combine a couple of questions from the audience. So if Washington manages to pass major election reform bills, how will those bills fare in the inevitable legal challenges that we brought against them? And how will the bills manage to be implemented, especially in the face of vehement red state opposition arguing that these kinds of reforms are akin to tyranny? So in the face of legal challenges and certain frenzied opposition, what would the path forward look like for the bills?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I think I'll start with the second one. On implementation, I think the way you do it is you go to local officials. These are people who are Republicans or Democrats or independents. They want to put on a good election every 2 years. They feel very professionally committed to that. They've been doing it for years. In other words, they've been doing it for a period of years. They are proud of what they do. They do it well if they have the tools. And what we are trying to do is provide them with a set of best practices and norms and standards that can guide them and help them and fortify their effort every 2 years. And I think if you go straight to those officials and you say to them, here's the toolbox, here's the new toolbox that can help you do your job well and help you relate to the public that you serve, that's the best prescription for making this happen. And in large measure, hopefully navigating our way through or around a lot of the kind of political divisiveness that has crept into that sort of baseline narrative of putting on a good election. So that's that point. On the challenges that will come, absolutely there will be. I mean, the next day there'll be a gazillion challenges coming from all over the place. I think we've built these bills in a way that anchors them constitutionally. We've borrowed very much on some of the scholarship and expertise that people like yourself, Nick, bring to this endeavor. But a lot, as you know, is now going to be anchored, certainly for the Freedom to Vote Act, in the Elections Clause of the Constitution. And Congress is absolutely clear authority to regulate the time, place, and manner of federal elections, and to make sure that when federal citizens show up to cast their vote, they can do that in a free and fair way. So we think we've built the constitutional undergirding of these bills in a way that can survive challenge. The Voting Rights Act is a little bit different because it's grounded in some other provisions, and we've seen with the Brnovich case and certainly the Shelby case, the Supreme Court moving in a direction of really undoing that jurisprudence, which creates some real exposure. But I think we get to the end of any challenges if we get these bills passed with a system that really gives people their voice back in this country. I'm very confident and optimistic about that.
If any of the other panelists want to chime in, you should feel free. If not, I can ask another question from the audience. So how can we address the distrust in government, polarization, corruption, the dominance of powerful, wealthy interests without also tackling the question of extreme income and wealth inequality, given that extreme inequality is a driver of a lot of these political problems that we see?
I mean, I'll weigh in on that, and if Ms. Osa has views on it too, I'm sure I'd welcome that. I think, look, the fact is you simply can't actually address the origins of this kind of distrust in government without addressing what is one of the core cleavages in American society. And, I see it across multiple spectrums. I mean, in Washington, D.C., where I'm talking to you from today, the average white family is 81 times wealthier than the average Black family. How are we supposed to have a coherent political commons in this city, just to take one city, when you're dealing with levels that are that yawning. And I think that we are also at a moment, this is sort of an encouraging fact, that we are at a moment when Americans are coming to a much greater recognition of how catastrophic these divides, these income inequalities and wealth inequalities, and I use the two terms slightly differently for reasons, that they are deeply damaging to our political culture and are essentially unsustainable. I mean, I will quote Justice Brandeis. There's some debate about whether it's his quote or not, but it is associated with him that we can either have democracy or we can have wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we can't have both. And there is a degree to which I think we're seeing that play out now much more visibly than we have. It's beyond the scope of our discussion, I think, to sort of go into a full-fledged conversation about the origins of radical inequality, but I don't see them as, it's almost impossible to do one without the other.
Any thoughts from the other panelists? And of course, other legislation right now, like the reconciliation package, can be seen as targeting inequality in ways that are complementary to what the election reform bills are doing in the political space. So here's one more question from the audience. If the people who are trying to restrict voting are smart enough to break up their efforts into many separate bills, none of which individually might be overly offensive, why aren't the folks on the other side also considering similar strategies, dividing the massive federal bills into smaller pieces, maybe none of which would individually be as controversial as the entire package?
Well, let me respond to that, because unfortunately, the situation of the current Republican Party in Washington, I'm not going to paint Republicans across the country with the broad brush of that, but the lawmakers in Washington have made it very clear that they're not interested in any real reform when it comes to the voting side as a party and in terms of their leadership. Mitch McConnell, Leader McCarthy in the House, they've stood against it four square. And we actually tried to test this proposition, Nick. We took parts of HR 1 in the 116th Congress, and we put them forward as separate bills, and all the Republicans voted against them. So as a strategy, it sounds good that you kind of pare things down or break them up, and then you can get reasonable people to do reasonable things. But unfortunately, a decision has been made at the highest levels within the leadership of the Republican Party in Washington to stand against all this. And I think that just reflects that they've gotten very comfortable with the toolbox of winning elections that is very much anti-democratic, to just call it like it is, unfortunately. Again, I don't think that's what the broad public is interested in. They want to elevate their voice and create more access for themselves and their families. But that's not the prescription coming from Washington. So I think you have to come with this robust set of norms and standards, uniform standards across the country that lift the voices of every American, provide broad access. That's the only way you're going to stop this sort of chipping away that's happening every single day at the state level on people's ability to vote.
Great. One last quick question, because we're running to the end of our hour. Misinformation, disinformation through social media, through TV and radio, also seems to be part of this story. Those kinds of efforts help to explain why the narrative of fraud catches on. They help to explain why many people don't have much confidence in our elections. So are there any efforts out there, any initiatives that might be able to combat the role of misinformation and disinformation in the political sphere?
I think there are all types of organizations that are looking at this problem very deeply, both from a platform perspective, from a small d democratic perspective. from a political perspective about how harmful this problem of misinformation and disinformation is. I say that disinformation is a tool for fools and anarchists. People really don't understand what they are getting into, and there's a reason that when you read research on it, every paper starts with please don't do this. We'll try to talk about how to push back at it, but please don't do this. We don't want to get there. And so we are in a situation where if you're a pro-democracy organization, you are also fighting disinformation. And you are also trying to put out best practices and helping people to understand how to respond. And we do a lot of that work. And one of the things that we are constantly trying to explain to people is that all of our brains work the same, and we're all susceptible to disinformation. Because very simply, the more times people hear something, the more likely they are to believe that it is true and to believe that others believe it is true as well. And so having someone amplifying lies, amplifying mistruths, amplifying things that are skewed is extraordinarily harmful to a community psyche, to a country's psyche. And that is also why efforts to debunk, to try to dunk on folks, to try to push back in ways that also amplify the underlying lie are also harmful. And so trying to explain to folks how to turn down the temperature, how to make sure that we can speak in a way that does not foster that allows for openness, that allows for discussion. That disinformation needs fear and anger to really spread, and how to prevent that environment from taking place is so important. And it's also important, again, to look back onto history, and that this is not the first time we have seen waves of disinformation. It might be more aggressive, but we've seen this before in this country in efforts to push back on voting. We have seen these same fraud narratives. We saw 33 duly elected Black legislators in Georgia never seated because of accusations of fraud. We saw the Louisiana PBS pinchback, the first duly elected U.S. sitting senator in Louisiana, never seated because of these same allegations. We saw in North Carolina them try to take over and overthrow a duly elected government because of similar allegations. In Mississippi, over and over and over again, we saw these claims, these false claims of election misconduct lead to election subversion. And so there are all types of if any pro-democracy organization you can think of is also fighting this effort. And it's also, I think, important for us to recognize that a lot of these problems are not new. And that's why it's so important to what we've said before, that we push back and we try to mitigate this in a large way with the For the People Act, with the Freedom to Vote Act, because if democracy is in peril, it's not time for small bills. It's time for significant action.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot more questions from the audience about money in politics, about gerrymandering, about the future of the Voting Rights Act. I encourage all of you with an interest in those issues to tune in for future sessions in this Democracy Speaker Series, where we'll be delving into those topics in a lot more detail. That now brings us to the end of this hour. So I want to again thank our panelists, Congressman Sarbanes, Ms. Osa, and Evan Osnos. Thanks for a really terrific conversation and a great start to this Democracy Speaker Series.